When the Assad regime fell on the 8th of December 2024, something happened in Syria's humanitarian response that aid workers have been waiting more than a decade for. The map opened up. For 13 years, Syria's aid operations had been one of the most fragmented and politically contested in the world. Assistance reached different parts of the country through entirely separate channels. UN cross-border convoys from Turkey to the opposition-held northwest, Damascus-based operation serving government areas, and a third response in the Kurdish-administrated northeast. Organizations ran firewalled programs, deliberately walling off their operations in one area of control or another, so as not to compromise either. Where aid crossed front lines at all, it crossed slowly, and usually only with permissions that could be withdrawn at any moment. The architecture had already been crumbling before Assad fell. The UN Security Council's cross-border mechanism, or the legal authorization that since 2014 had allowed aid into the northwest without Damascus's consent, collapsed in July 2023 after a Russian veto, replaced by a fragile, consent-based arrangement that handed the government of Damascus far more control than what reached opposition areas. Then the regime itself was gone. What followed was, in the words of aid agencies on the ground, an unprecedented opening. Many NGOs moved to Damascus within days and started opening liaison offices as soon as January 2025. Firewalls came down. NGOs that had spent years picking sides could, for the first time, contemplate operating across the whole country. Visa and access processes for international staff eased, roads between the northwest and Damascus reopened, organizations that have never had presence inside Syria began scoping missions. And here's the central paradox of this episode. That opening arrived at the precise moment that money disappeared. In early 2025, the new U.S. administration froze or restructured foreign aid and began by dismantling U.S. aid, historically one of the largest single donors for the Syria response, channeling close to $580 million in the fiscal year of 2024 alone. Programs were terminated, reimbursements withheld, and surveys found that at least half of aid organizations in the Northwest had fallen into debt. The UN warded off cuts of at least 40% across the humanitarian community in Syria, with NGOs hit hardest. Globally, 2025 became the worst-funded humanitarian year in decades, and the deadliest one on record for aid workers across the world, with more than 380 killed. The needs on the ground, however, did not shrink to match the budgets. Roughly 15.6 million Syrians, close to 70% of the total population, still require humanitarian assistance in 2026. Over 6 million remained internally displaced. At the same time, more than 1.6 million refugees and nearly 2 million IDPs have gone home since the regime fell. Returns that are themselves a source of strain flowing back into communities with shattered infrastructure, contaminated lands, and almost no functioning service to receive them. Syria sits on the World Food Bank program's list of global hunger hotspots, and the World Bank puts reconstruction needs north of $200 billion. Layered on top is the security environment that had changed the character rather than calmed them. The fixed front lines are gone, but so is the predictability that came with them, replaced by indiscriminate gunfire, the sharp rising criminality, theft, kidnap risk, and the constant lethal presence of unexploded ordnance and explosive remnants of war. Also, sectarian violence in the coast in March 2025 and in Sueda in July in the same year left a deep wound that reshaped where and for whom it is safe to operate. Running underneath all of this is a quieter, more structural question. Sanctions have come off. The US terminated its Syria program in mid-2025. The EU lifted its economic measures. The Caesar Act was repealed. The World Bank and the IMF are back. The EU pledged hundreds of millions in recovery. And there is a powerful pull to declare the emergency over and pivot from humanitarian relief to reconstruction and development, what is commonly known as the humanitarian development nexus. But millions of people are still in camps, still hungry, still one shock away from catastrophe. Pivot too soon and you abandon them. Pivot too late and you trap a recovering country in aid dependency. How a war-shattered, newly opened, dangerously underfunded country navigates this gap is what we're here to discuss with someone who watches it not just in Syria, but across the entire region. That's where we begin. My guest today is Scott Bollinger, Regional Director for the Middle East and Central Asia in the International NGO Safety Organization, INSO. It is an independent body that provides free, impartial safety and access analysis to humanitarian NGOs in the world's most dangerous operating environments. Scott has spent the better part of 2 decades inside this work. He worked in Afghanistan, Libya, and served as INSO's country director in both Iraq and Syria before moving to The Hague to take up a regional role. From that seat, he now oversees INSO's operations across a remarkable spread of crises: Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Yemen, Ukraine, among them, which gives him something rare, the ability to see Syria not in isolation, but against the pattern of how humanitarian access, funding, and the risk behave everywhere else. Scott, welcome to the Syria Spectrum.
Hi, Zach. Thank you for having me on. It's a real honor to participate. I've been listening to a few episodes, and I think this is a really good resource.
Thank you, Scott. Let's start with the 8th of December and the weeks after. INSO had people in Damascus almost immediately. From safety and access standpoint, what actually changed for the humanitarian organization when the regime fell? And how would you characterize access landscape in Syria today versus the one that NGOs were navigating in the previous decade?
Right. Well, let me say that we were all surprised by the events and how they unfolded, and even as a longtime Syria watcher, I want to be clear about that. I was not expecting HTS to pull ahead. I was initially very dismissive of the attack in the north. So, actually a few NGOs got started in December of 2024. But that was actually the amazing point. And it's really something where I'm proud of INSO because I saw the role that we played. So the role that we played was that we were across the border in a few days, setting things up. And we also had a position on the advisory board of SIRF, the Syria INGO Regional Forum, predating the current NGO platform. And we can talk a lot about that. But we made a point of bringing someone, making sure that the NGO coordination moved to Damascus right away. I think there's a lot of wait and see during these times. And it's like the dog that got the car. The one thing that we had as INSO, because we particularly specialize in coordination, I think we understand these dynamics. We had also been involved with all the different regional fora as well as the whole of Syria forum. And then we also we really prize in-country presence. And so with Syria, for a long time, it had been issued that we ran our north and south regions remotely. We could have an office in the east of the country because the self-administration allowed principled access in a way that the other groups did not in various ways. So we had the opportunity to go in, and I think we felt the writing on the wall. We wanted to try it out and we wanted to lead the way. And this was really important because, as NGOs, what do? We specialize in access, but particularly we're supposed to advise on access as well as security. We need to try it out. And it was very clear that it was okay to go. We were already sharing an office with another NGO before the end of December. And that very, very quickly became a permanent presence in country that just expanded throughout 2025 and is growing further in 26.
If someone just heard this without the context, they would think that suddenly there is an upcoming humanitarian relief that is going to reach Syria. But there's a cruel irony at the heart of this. Because just as the country is opening up, as organizations can finally reach the places that have been locked out for years, the funding collapse with the US aid cuts hitting the hardest. Of course, you also have the context, other conflicts that are taking place around the world. And you see funding patterns across the whole region. So I want to ask you, how has that collapse reshaped what NGOs in Syria can actually do with the access they've gained? And from what you're seeing, is it part of a wider regional or global pattern?
Yeah, so the cuts are complex, and the way that they affect Syria is also very specific. It depends upon sector as much as the organization or the job that they're doing. So in the case of Syria, it is not as acute as a lot of other places because there are other streams of funding in the sense that Europeans are heavily invested in stabilizing Syria in the context, whichever specific approach they're taking. And it's relatively high on the information agenda globally. So that Syria has done better in terms of funding. That does not change the fact that there were a lot of disruptions with canceled projects, particularly the concerns about camps. The Islamic State always has a disproportionate amount of attention span with Western policymakers who don't really understand the region's dynamics. So that, of course, added a lot of fuel to reverse some of the stop work orders. More broadly, the U.S. cuts were a double-edged sword because while they have taken capital out of the system before the system could readjust with other sorts of funding, they have also provided a new kind of lease on life to a sector that had often been dogged by aspersions of pro-Western bias. And these may or may not be true to varying degrees considering where the money is coming from. But for me, it was always a bit of an issue. And particularly on top of this, as someone that grew up in the United States, I could see the pernicious influence. So it was quite mixed in terms of things like protection and SGBV. The
What's that?
Americans would, yeah, it's a good point. So protection, we're talking about civilians, we're talking about human rights abuses, just trying to put it in the most basic terms. I know my protection colleagues will take issue with all of this. And SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence in particular. So these are things where the U.S. was very strong. In other places, they're preachy. They have weird contract regulations. They forget because they have empire brain that there are other regimes on the face of this world and other centers of power and that they're not at the center of everything. So in a lot of ways, for all the pain, I'm really happy to see them go and I'm happy to see their toys out of the pram. Can they get it together? Can they get a serious, incredible mechanism in the future? We'll see. And there's a real question of exactly what we want, if they're going to, play this kind of fantastical patriotism, American first, blah, blah, blah. We're in a world where the state actors really need to vie for legitimacy amongst more legitimate service providers like NGOs and local authorities and things like that. So we'll see how that works in the end, but it's been very complex. It still has made things more difficult in Syria because the U.S. was such a big funder. But given the constraints, and then we've also seen the American, disasters of this year, I think it is better for us as a sector in the long run that they're not around. They're trying to reconstitute right now. We'll see how that goes. My guess is that they have governance issues that are going to take them a long time to sort out before they can join the club of organized and established actors.
We'll get to the changing stakeholder landscape and donor landscape in a bit, especially with the introduction now of more Gulfy donors and more projects that are coming both in the humanitarian and the development front. For those interested in the changing development landscape in Syria, please refer to our episode on the end of development or read Aaron Toose's piece on foreign policy on it. But for now, I want to get to the end of the cross-border era. I want to just understand the dynamics. And I want to ask about the bargaining power that NGOs have with authorities, because before it was quite unilateral, it was quite direct. For years, the entire debate about aid in Syria, it was ran through the UN Security Council. So politics always played a role in the humanitarian space. And this is where Turkey also plays a role. But this mechanism died in 2023. And now the response is going through Damascus on a consent basis. So Scott, since you understand the border crossing processes deeply, what has the practical reality of that shift been? So how has aid physically moved? Who controls it? What's the bargaining position of NGOs that they find themselves in today? Because the situation is never perfect. The question is, what's the relative power now?
It's gotten a lot easier. Before, I do need to say a word about how things were before. We had essentially 3 zones with the HTS and SIG controlled northwest of the country. We had the self-administration controlled northeast, and we had government controlled areas. And, the northwest was essentially it was a difficult access regime that, I think, was difficult for a lot of legacy reasons, also difficult thanks to a lot of various Turkish kind of restrictions one way or the other. That's very complicated. Meanwhile, the government controlled areas were legacy area. You stayed there to stay there. It was almost impossible to do principally. We did not choose to enter there because we knew that our reporting lacked for not being there, but it was better than if we were essentially hostages to the government. Routinely, NGOs were forced to hire and fire people that they didn't want to. There was all kinds of political pressure and leverage. It was completely obvious. And we did not want to be a part of that in any way. And we were also kind of internally decrying the movement of whole of Syria coordination mechanisms to Damascus, which was completely ahead of time. We saw some countries caved was particularly bad. And obviously some NGOs had a head start, but served them very well at the beginning. But it was very short-sighted, and one thing that was apparent was the government in Damascus will not last one way or another. It was cannibalizing itself. It had very little legitimacy. Was not clear exactly how that would fall apart, but it was clear that something was going to happen. And I'll say also in the Northeast was definitely the best access regime. The SDF really did a lot to kind of promote and enable. And it was the place where you could in a principled fashion, really deal with the most Syrians. So what happened afterwards is luckily we went to a sort of combination of, of what we had seen from the best of the Northwest and the Northeast, in that the government, although it was legacy Northwest Syria factions, primarily in the form of HTS, they took a very open and expansive view. There were initial fears that they would just start applying the Idlib access regime countrywide. That didn't really last. What we've seen in reality is something more like what the SDF had before, where the government has taken the initial approach of let's support you, don't annoy people, and then go ahead and do your job, and let's sit together and figure out the registration process. Now, I'll be careful to say, we have a team on the ground there. They're dealing with the particulars, which are inherently sensitive at the moment. So, yeah, even if I knew, it's not something that I would want to discuss, but it's also changing by the day. The overall picture is very full and very collaborative, and it's one of the best I've seen, having been in a number of these transition scenarios.
Interesting, because it's all about the kind of threat, the kind of danger that you need to respond to. And this is INSO's core work. So you've mentioned before that the picture in Syria has changed the character rather than simply improved. It's a different beast to deal with. So the fixed front lines are gone, but at the same time, criminality, kidnap, risk, indiscriminate fire, unexploded ordnance, they've moved to the forefront. This is usually what a post-conflict situation is. But then there's also the sectarian violence that took place last year. So for NGOs and INSO support, what's the most serious risk right now? And how is that different from the risk environment that was under the Assad regime for NGOs operating on the ground?
That's a very good question, because we actually see things, even though they're moving in a positive direction, and it's certainly good that the 15 years of conflict are at an end, almost 15 years. We were in a predictable place before, particularly between March 2020 and December 2024. The front lines were still active, but generally stable. Things were predictable, and you can issue a lot of advice and know what to do. What happens when those front lines are removed? We're in an area of unknown threats and possibilities. And that was the first half of 2025, is not understanding whether a bout of sectarian violence is going to escalate and take in other communities. Are there going to be more attacks with collateral involvement that say target senior government officials? We didn't know any of this kind of stuff, and we have slowly built up a picture. Even with that picture coming more clearly into focus with well over over a year and a half now since the collapse of the previous government, it still is all over Syria that things can happen to you. And a lot of these things are more impactful because what usually affects an NGO, occasionally, when you have the Russians, you would get the double tap strike. You would get some kind of direct targeting. Most of the time, what NGOs are dealing with are small issues, an HR issue that leads to a direct threat against the organization. Maybe petty theft, small scale embezzlement. We see a lot of cases where an organization rented something they thought was legitimate. It turned out that the land had been seized inappropriately from the previous owner under the Assad government. And somebody comes back to collect and they don't know anything about the NGO. So you're seeing a lot of issues like this. Conflict sensitivity now that we have people mixed together, right? So Kurdish and Arabic staff really, talking and interacting in the office. Staff of more kind of liberal and illiberal orientations acting together. So these are the concerns that we're seeing, of which a lot of it is less threat to life, but at the same time, more concerns for operations, more vulnerabilities with local authorities, with national authorities, with beneficiary communities, and also just the fact that this can happen anywhere now. And also because NGOs can travel anywhere, there's a lot more exposure, and that's something that we see anywhere. So before, you would never see an NGO incident in a place like Mesyeth because it was very few people that were able to go there or could go there. So, now you have people on mountain roads, you get car accidents, right? Not related to the security environment whatsoever, but an additional threat that is relevant to NGOs that they have to track in terms of their operations and keeping their staff safe.
I'm hearing a lot of issues related to the economic collapse. I'm hearing a lot of issues related to the lack of administrative capacity to kind of run the place. And it's really a hybrid between this local and global kind of challenges. At this time, I'm really thinking about the link between the national, the local, and the global. So trying to see the link between the forest and the trees. And I want to move in this part of the conversation to take a bird's eye view a bit, talk about the localization question, which is something we're hearing a lot about. Because this transition is happening at the same time that the humanitarian sector, is talking seriously about localization. So shifting funding, decision-making, risk to the national and to the local organizations instead of having it from the donor HQs. In Syria, you have a deep ecosystem of Syrian NGOs that kept the response alive for the last 15 years, often at enormous personal cost. I'm thinking here of the NGO Forum and all of the local NGOs that more or less kept providing these services even when it was almost impossible to do so if you wanted to play by the rules. So as the international funding contracts, are we seeing a genuine localization, or are local organizations simply being handed the risk without the resources? And how does INSO think about supporting these local actors specifically?
Yeah, localization, it's good that we get there because I think Syria is a really unique case. Also, INSO's been doing, as the largest coordination platform globally, we've been doing our own research on localization that will be coming up and will be released soon in a study by a colleague. And we've tried to tease out a lot of the issues. So I don't want to speak to that before it's fully released. But one of the issues with localization is people feeling included and knowing how to represent themselves. And Syrian civil society, for me, has really stood up by how advanced and organized it is. So you have other places like, Ukraine, where civil society is technically better at dealing with mechanisms, getting funding, knowing how to get media and attention. Syria's civil society was very good at mobilizing, getting involved, taking advantage of diaspora links, and actually forming coherent organizations that can take things forward. And we see a lot with kind of unstructured organizations. People are familiar with the sort of emergency response rooms and things like that. And while it's important to deal with kind of ad hoc responders, it is also really important to understand the value of an organization and how organizations mobilize. And we've really seen a lot of Syrian organizations, all the way from like White Helmets to organizations like Hand in Hand, and a number of big names I won't even get into, that have really done a good job. Even some of the only like principled involvement we've seen on the government side, really came from some kind of independent Syrian organizations or indigenously rooted organizations. So the localization is strong. Furthermore, what we see from Syrians is a real understanding of the civil society space. And while a lot of INGOs are better structured to move in resources, they are often not as well structured in understanding their political positionality as NGOs and really dealing with the gap between humanitarian and development assistance. And that's what Syria needs. Food kits don't keep you going for very long. You need politics to eat. And that's the kind of thing that Syrians are focused on. I think they're also really focused on it. The kind of depth and quality of conversations that I find in Syria is really something that I would like to bring other places. And I am looking at other places like Ukraine, Yemen, Afghanistan, Palestine that have very kind of structured civil societies and I'm talking about local organizations, a lot of people that know what they're doing. With Syria, it's good. I mean, in general, we need Syrians to come to places like the Netherlands and the United States and explain to people what's going on because they've dealt with it. Finally, another factor I want to add in this, and let me get to INSO's role in this, is the fact that, look, we had so many years of conflict in Syria. So everyone kind of honed their skills. People got tired of fighting. I think people learned the limits of what coercion and compellence could bring for them. Also, people, went through the whole process of starting up their NGOs, dealing with the invariable dramas about management and hierarchy, and also, getting families, putting their egos aside. And a lot of the organizations that resulted have been quite honed. Of course, you still have the issues you're always going to have, but people have had time to mature. Organizations have had time to mature within this space. And that's both a mix within the diaspora, within local civil society that started on the ground. Shout out to all the people in government controlled areas that kept the lights on in their own way with small local level initiatives, right? So that's there. Now, INSO's role in supporting this is that we reach out equally to international and local NGOs. So we really don't privilege one. The whole point of being an NGO is that you're independent from a state actor. We understand there's different levels of alliance and people are being funded by different things, but we're civil society. We're legitimate. The state, makes a claim, a monopoly claim, but that claim is, it is available for contestation. It creates a power silo that creates gaps. NGOs and civil society are really here for those. And as INSO, what we do is we really reach out globally to all these legitimate organizations. And we give other kind of political monopolies, like state actors, the ability to participate and do the right thing within the objective reality that we live in.
Yeah. The relationship between NGOs and the states since 1990 has been quietly contested because this is a deeper conversation that I think could deserve its own episode. But for now, I'm still thinking about the structure that we find Syria in, then we find other places. And something you've mentioned is the humanitarian development. This is a wonky term that you'll hear. Anyone who's ever worked in the humanitarian sector knows the dilemmas that go with it. And we're not going to go into the academic discussion, but I want to get your thoughts because sanctions are off. The World Bank and the IMF are back. The EU is pledging recovery money. Now we have the EU-Syria cooperation agreement also starting the talks. And there's real political appetite to call the emergency over and move to reconstruction. There's a lot of money to be made, to put it bluntly, but the camps aren't empty and the needs are still enormous. So from where you sit, is there a risk that the international community pivots from humanitarian response to development too quickly? And what would be the consequences of that on the ground? How do you square the circle?
I'm going to deliver a khutbah on institutional friction. I don't know how else to put this, or bureaucratic friction. Because there's a number of different elements here. First of all, you mentioned the sanctions, right? We've seen real friction, one, in technically getting the sanctions removed. The other is on individual organizations and the amount of risk that they're going to have. Every time I come back to Syria, is a different question of, do my US mobile phone cards work, or my Dutch SIM card or something like that? And so even while technically these things are allowed, is an organization going to invest in that? Now, getting to the aid sector in general, there is a split between humanitarian and development funding, which makes sense in that humanitarian funding is supposed to be beyond politics. It's supposed to be entirely needs based. And those of you that know me will say that the most political statement is saying that something is beyond politics. And here we are. And development aid is supposed to be inherently political. It's a state to state thing. Now, I think this is very cute. This is a remnant of the 20th century, and this is relevant of kind of sovereign state monopolies that really walked and believed themselves as the be all and end all of political power. And that world's not here anymore. What we have, what is emerging, is an aid sector that is more generally viewed. And one of the things that I argue frequently, and I think really applies to INSO partners, is we're looking to see humanitarian principles throughout the entire spectrum. So you can be an organization, you can do development work, you can do a project entirely with a line ministry, but are you still looking at your humanitarian principles and developing that? And I'll go one step further in that. For a state to be legitimate, the state needs to operate on humanitarian principles. And, it's not my position to be the judge of it, but I can tell you if you're a state actor and you're listening, you're following humanitarian principles, good. You're doing the basic minimum that you need to do. If you can't do that, then get it together or things aren't going to work out for you right now. But we as a community need to structure ourselves to orient in the way that reality works. And that is a coherent sector. So the idea of pivoting from humanitarian to development, we don't really have the institutional mechanisms for that because you're dealing with the kind of political issues. And what that means for the state actors from donor agencies is we move from a situation where politically we understand the limits here to something where we can make our own deals with it. Well, you should keep the political ends because, Syria will become stable or not based on the health of its civil society. Now, the mechanism for funding, what is the nexus? What is the gap between people that need services now and are not able to provide them in a state that is genuinely trying and would like to provide them insofar as we can see? It is actually developing those sort of donor mechanisms. A lot of the German Stiftungen, like Heinrich Böll and Friedrich Ebert and things like that are really have those mechanisms. So we've also seen, previous American organizations like IRI and NDI were quite involved in that. It'd be something for the private sector to really step up into, in that it's not something governments want to fund because it is inherently political. It's not clear needs-based assistance in the most kind of purest reading of humanitarianism. So we need to look at those humanitarian principles and really institutionalize them. And I don't know how that's going to happen. I think one thing that I'm routinely saying quietly to everyone in my personal capacity and everyone else that I know is saying it is fund these organizations that are dealing with things like early recovery. And frankly, we do see donor support in that, in European countries, this is often framed as a migration issue, which necessarily care about. But if it brings more money into Syria, that is good for Europe. So, that's fine in that sense. We're more interested in seeing the most stable outcome for Syria and Syrians, and I think one of our points of view is everyone who lives on this planet is equally a system. That's a practical reality. We've got to bring the politicians with us on that.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a lot of civil society that is sprouting, it's springing. I read that in the first year after Assad fell, 3,500 local NGOs registered in Syria. Now, are all of them going to survive the next few years? I don't think so. I think it's our role to ensure that the environment is there for as many of them to survive. So this increases the likelihood of stability. And to be honest, it increases the safety of investments for people who want to invest and make money. You need the infrastructure that goes around it. And that starts with the basic providing the human rights over there, the fact that people don't need to be oppressed. Now, let's look ahead. And this is the last question, Scott. Syria has a narrow, fragile window. Access is open in a way that it hasn't been in a generation, but the funding, security environment, and the institutions are all working against it. If you could direct the attention of donors and decision makers to maybe one or two things right now that could make the biggest difference to keeping aid flowing safely through this transition in the next few years where politics are being redefined, what would it be?
So, yeah, I think right now the institutional things are actually key. It's formalizing that sanctions relief, I think makes a big difference. We see more and more signs of confidence. What is going to happen initially is a lot of Syrians that know the market and know the risks with their kind of interested foreigners that know and trust them, or maybe have been involved and care about Syria, really open up the way right now, regardless of whether you have the formal legal mechanisms. But we need to see that instituted so that, a number of different actors, Syria is brought within, the scope of kind of normal governance, knowing what that is and the kind of world we live in right now. It's variable, but civil society is really going to be key in that. And, before you mentioned, 3,500 NGOs, with NGOs, it's like with new businesses, there's a bit of a 70-30 rule, to put it loosely, where it's, 30% doing 70% of the work, or 30% of them will succeed, and the other 70% won't. Or some of them will just be, a local based, organization that just focuses on literacy in its street in a place like, like Salonfa or whatever, right? So you'll see those kinds, you'll see different organizations. What we need to do is create the space for, those 350 strong organizations to be good ones. And because you're dealing with the legacy of legal reform, and really anyone that's interested should read up, even if you had all the sanctions removed, you have this massive law that is not only kind of crazy, Bothy feeder dreams.
Which one? Law number 10?
No, I'm talking about the corpus of law that will
Okay.
exist from Syria before. Now,
Yeah.
Law 10 is always an example that people use,
Mhm.
but you've had, over 50 years, and it's not, I mean, look at the law before the corrective movement, right? Like, you have this morass of kind of essentially like, Ba'athi practice and law. You need to reform those statutes one by one. You need to, deal with people that are used to working in a certain bureaucratic culture in a bureaucratic way. They're still looking for the stamp. They don't know the stamp doesn't make a difference anymore. But you need to give them the stamp, right? So you generate it and you put it on your PDF, and everyone's happy and goes about their day. So all of those little frictions, civil society is going to be key in this. So not that anyone who's listening in a political position should at all stop focusing on the kind of formal mechanisms, but the most practical thing we can do is support and increase the impact of civil society, because those will form the interest groups and the people that speak up, that both reform and iterate new policies, and also, think of, respond to what needs to be changed, and can help the system be resilient in the future. So it is baby steps. We're seeing these various alignment issues come to the fore in terms of needs, in terms of the government's desire to provide services, people's needs, people's pre-existing situations. They're in Turkey, their kids speak Turkish, and there's a lot of personal friction that stop people from returning. Maybe they have a asylum status, but they don't have their residency sorted in another country. There are a lot of things that we're just not going to be able to deal with here, but you can focus on some important nodes and really supporting civil society, which supports the development of the private sector, supports the transition to development, supports the structuring and growth of the government to fulfill its duties and obligations as a state.
Wonderful. There's a certain chance where you can speak your mind and criticize the government and the economy and the things around you. And my hope is to Syrians who are listening as well, for us not to be quiet, even if the situation becomes less friendly and more hostile again. I think this is kind of the immunity that we've collectively developed over the last 15 years.
No, and it's a good point. The first few times, 2024, 25, when I went back to Damascus, I was like, okay, it's really good in Damascus, but let me see how it is outside. One of the things I've really enjoyed on like trips to the countryside is really sort of feeling how over it people are. It's not that people necessarily like one another, but people are tired, and I think everyone is in the mode of like, let's see what's going on. And I was, sitting at a cafe near the Citadel, where they used to have like all the crossings, and it was a divided city, and now it's like an open cafe. You could just walk up to the Citadel, and there were tourists from Deir ez-Zor coming
Mm-hmm.
to visit, and places like that. And it's not that people had a lot of money. It's just like, I can travel in Syria again. And everyone was just curious and keen to have the conversation. Also, myself as a foreigner, well, what are you here for? I'm here for work, but I just took a few days out to do some sightseeing because I wanted to see Aleppo on foot.
Yeah. And honestly, I encourage everyone who can to visit, see it for themselves. It's really a once in a lifetime chance. Scott Bollinger, thank you for being on the Syria Spectrum.
Thank you very much for having me, Zach. It's an honor and great podcast.
That was Scott Bollinger, the Regional Director for the Middle East and Central Asia at the International NGO Safety Organization. As a reminder, the views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of our guest and do not necessarily reflect the position of the Syria Spectrum. A sincere thank you to our outstanding production and research team for their continued dedication. The Syria Spectrum podcast is produced with the support of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. I'm Zakaria Al-Shmali, and this is the Syria Spectrum, bringing you policy through perspective.